Good evening, everyone. My name is Tthe, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here today with many thanks to the publisher, the University of Toronto Press, for the launch of Poverty and Austerity Amid Prosperity, a Comparative Introduction by Gregg M. Olsen. I'd like to thank all of you here personally for joining us here tonight, and also thank all of you joining us on YouTube tonight as well. It's a great pleasure to have you all gathered here. I have a few housekeeping notes, which are potentially not particularly thrilling, but short. And following that, I'll get off the stage and turn things over to the infinitely more interesting special guests that we have here tonight. While you're located in this space, we just humbly ask that you please do keep your masks on. You'll notice that everybody who wanders behind a microphone will have their mask removed. We are in a performance space right now, and as soon as we leave this space for the book signing at the end of the evening, we will magically be transported into the retail environment, where mask use will still be required, and we will just ask you to please socially distance from those who are not in your household when you are lining up for the book signing. I'll have more completely thrilling housekeeping notes about signing procedure at the end of the evening, so that is something to look forward to. After I'm finished up here, your host, Dr. Elizabeth Comack, will come up to introduce Gregg, and he'll then have a few words. Following that, there'll be a conversation just immediately to my left, and then there'll be the opportunity for all you gathered here today to ask questions. As it seems a little bit unwise to have everybody sharing a microphone, the way we've been doing this is I'll approach you, hopefully not particularly ominously, and ask you to ask me your question, which I will then repeat into the microphone for the benefit of all those watching at home and for the benefit of all you gathered here tonight. With that in mind, as I can't possibly do justice to the inevitable eloquence of any comments you might have, I would ask that you please do limit yourself to questions, and please keep those relatively succinct, just so my weary brain can convey them appropriately to Gregg, and he can then answer them. You will have ample opportunity during the signing to offer any more extensive comments or put any more extensive questions to Gregg that you might have at that point. That is officially it for me right now. So I have the immense pleasure of inviting up your host for tonight, Dr. Elizabeth Comack, Distinguished Professor Emerita in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Manitoba, has had a 4-decade career of researching and teaching about social justice issues. We've had the opportunity to launch many of her books here at the store, and it's always such a huge pleasure to have her behind a microphone. Please join me in welcoming her tonight.
Thanks very much, John. As we can all appreciate, organizing a book launch in the middle of a pandemic is no small feat. And so I think we really need to give our thanks to Tthe and to the other folks at McNally Robinson for making this possible, this happen. So thanks very much. Now, during the past 20 months, there have been very few occasions where I've been motivated to venture out of my house. But the opportunity to participate in a book launch is one that I don't take lightly, especially if it's for a dear friend and colleague like Gregg Olsen. I actually have a clear memory of the first time that I met Gregg. And I don't know if you remember this. He has a rock solid memory, so maybe you do. It was on December 8th, 1989. We were both at a vigil at the Legislative Building. It was 2 days after the Montreal massacre had occurred. Now, in the crush of all the people that were there that night, I remember being introduced to this new hire in the sociology department at the University of Manitoba. As fate would have it, I joined Gregg the next year as a member of that department. So we've been colleagues and friends for over 3 decades now. I know we don't look it, but we've been. teaching for that long. Over that span of time, I've been witness to the strong body of scholarship that Gregg has produced. Scholarship that's concerned about social inequalities and the potential of welfare states in their various forms to alleviate those inequalities. Gregg has been assisted in that work by his 7 sojourns as a guest researcher, mostly at the University of Stockholm in Sweden, or what we like to kid him about, the Garden of Sweden, right? Because it's a country that's very near and dear to his heart. His colleagues were ever so nervous that we might never get him back to Winnipeg at the end of his Swedish sabbatical, but he does seem to have returned every time, at least so far. Over his years as an academic, Gregg has been active not only in devoting his energies to his teaching, but in presenting his work at conferences and publishing numerous journal articles. On top of that, he's also written a number of important books. In addition to 2 edited collections, he's produced The Struggle for Economic Democracy in Sweden, which came out in 1992, The Politics of the Welfare State, Canada, Sweden, and the United States, which was published in 2002, and Power and Inequality, A Comparative Introduction, which was in 2011. Each of these books has received rave reviews by the likes of well-known people such as Tom Bottomore, and I'm still blown away by the fact that he had a comment by Tom Bottomore, who's been described as Britain's best known and highly regarded sociologist. As well, other notable Canadians like Walter Clement, Bill Carroll, Ed Broadbent, they've all weighed in and given Gregg these rave reviews for his books. His most recent book, the one that we're here to celebrate tonight, is, as John has said, titled Poverty and Austerity Amid Prosperity, A Comparative Introduction. It too has already received rave reviews. One by Danish sociologist Gösta Esping Andersen, who's been described as the Dean of Welfare State Scholars, right? He has deemed the book to be extremely timely and lucid and highly readable. Nicely done, Gregg. I don't know how you do it, but nicely done.
Gosh.
So I want to welcome all of you here tonight, both those of you who are here in person and those of you who are watching via YouTube. And as Gregg, or as John has mentioned, I'm your host for this evening, which is quite an honor and a privilege to be here. So Gregg's going to make a few introductory remarks, and then we're going to have this conversation, but the conversation is going to be me peppering him with questions, and then you as the audience get to pepper him with questions so that we can find out more about what this book is about and how it came into being. So I'll give it over to you, Gregg. Thanks. Six feet.
Set it for short. Thanks. So I'd also like to begin by thanking John, who's been doing organizing these great events for a very long time, and thank McNally Robinson. And I also want to thank everybody here, my colleagues and friends and students and former students who are here tonight. And I also want to thank Elizabeth, who, as she mentioned, we've been friends for a very long time, and I was really honored that she was willing to host this tonight. I realize tonight is very cold out, and so I appreciate you coming to the cold. And not only that, I know that tonight's the first installment of the Beatle documentary. So really appreciate you coming, because I almost didn't come myself when I knew that was on. So the last time I did this, it was in Prairie Inc., and I think Elizabeth was the host back then too. But one thing was different this time, which is they became this thing in conversation with, right? And we weren't really sure what that meant. So, Elizabeth called and said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "I'm not sure. I think it's kind of like an Oprah thing, right? Where the Oprah show, where you sit there, we have questions back and forth, and there's gifts under the chairs when you're done." And she said, "Well, who provides the gifts?" And I said, "Well, I think Oprah does, right?" So I have to check and see if there's anything there. I guess we can get started. I'll just make my way back there. Thank you.
So this isn't so much going to be a conversation, and it's not going to be a lecture, right? But we do want to find out some more about this book. And so one of the things I'm interested in is getting Gregg's take on, okay, so what is this book about? And especially, you know, this isn't your first book. I mean, you have this body of work that's developed over time. So, and books have kind of a history to them, right? And so I'm interested to learn your take on how you understand this book, how you see it, and how you see it as connecting with other work that you've done.
Okay, thank you. So these last three books are kind of they're part of a trinity, I guess, in a way, and I wrote them in the opposite direction that I originally thought I would do. So the first one was a book on the welfare state, comparing welfare states in different countries and seeing what's their character and what's their impact. And then the second one was called Power and Inequality. It was looking at inequality, a whole bunch of different dimensions like social mobility and access to rights and things like that, and especially the distribution of income and wealth in different countries. And that's an area that has really received a lot of attention over the last 10 years, right? So if you think about there's been probably 25, 35 books that have come out on that topic in the last decade. So people like Tony Atkinson and Danny Dorling and Emil Carroll and Oxfam and Thomas Piketty and a whole bunch of others. So much so that, you know, if we say the 1% and the 99%, everybody here knows what we're talking about, right? Or if we talk about a handful of people that have, you know, 8, sometimes people say 20, 30 at the most, have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world's population, right? Those kinds of things. So everybody's familiar with that. I noticed that I'm always updating my lectures, trying to keep up with this incredible asymmetry of wealth. So I remember not that long ago when we were all shocked to learn that the wealthy people had $100 million, right? And now we're talking about centibillionaires. And so if you think about somebody, it's numbers that I find mine hard to get my head around. So you think about somebody like Elon Musk, right? His net worth is $255 billion. Actually, it's gone up since then. But, you know, how do you get your head around a number like that? Well, somebody can help us. Is that somebody calculated that if you were paid $5,000 a day, 7 days a week, for 365 days a year, it would take you 140,000 years to get that much wealth, right? So that's one person. So we've learned a lot, I think, about from these invaluable studies of asymmetry of wealth. We've learned that without any kind of mechanisms to redistribute, inequality will just keep getting greater and greater, right? We've learned a lot about the social determinants of health. We've learned a lot about how democracy is undermined by this kind of wealth asymmetry. Excuse me. But what's also happened with all of this wealth is that we've kind of lost track of the other end, right? It was so overwhelmed that we forgot to think about or really pay a lot of attention to what's happening at the other end. So that's really what I'm trying to do with this book. So I'm looking at poverty and homelessness, which in a lot of studies of poverty, homelessness is kind of neglected as well. So I try to focus on those two things here. Of course, there are poverty books coming out, but most of them are single country case studies, right? And so they look at, you know, what's happening with the poverty levels in Canada, which is very useful, very valuable, but it misses something, right? We miss kind of the markedly different poverty profiles that you see even within the world of wealthy nations, wealthy capitalist nations. So that's something that I'm trying to do here. And some of the books provide a technical account, right? How is poverty measured? How is it conceptualized? How is it defined? Those kinds of things. And those books don't tend to use data. They don't really use countries. They don't provide any examples. And the third kind of book that you see is theory books, right? How do you explain poverty? And those ones don't tend to not use data either. So what I try to do in this book is what I call a one-stop account of poverty. So I'm looking at all of those things. So I'm trying to provide, sort of a definition and a way to think about poverty and let everybody know about that if you're not familiar with those things. But also look at what's going on, right, and what's going around in Canada, but always relating that, especially to thinking about what's happening in the world. So taking this kind of comparative perspective. So one of the things that we see when we look at poverty, and that usually comes up, is the rates of poverty, right? Or what I call the degree of poverty, how much poverty is in a country. And that's obviously a very useful thing that we need to know, right? But the ways those are established in different countries, there are different ways of doing it. Is you set a poverty line, right? And you say how many people are below that poverty line. But what often gets missed there is the severity of poverty, right? So you can have a poverty line and people can be living right here, or they can be living way down below the poverty line, right? So we need to think about that as well. So I try to do that in this book for the different countries that I look at. It's called The Depth of Poverty. Right, so they have these, they're called the 4 Ds: the degree of poverty or rate, the depth of poverty. The duration of poverty is really important too, right? How long people are living in poverty. Because it's much worse, right? In a whole bunch of ways, much worse on your health and so on, if you're in poverty for a very long time. And the last D is the distribution. So poverty isn't evenly or randomly distributed in any country, right? Certain groups that people I think are pretty familiar with by now tend to have higher rates of poverty: women, children, single parent families, racialized groups, and so on, right? So that's what I am doing in this book. I'm trying to look at those things in a number of countries, with focusing on Canada. I mentioned I also look at homelessness because that's surprisingly an area that most poverty books don't look at. It's a really important, unfortunately, growing area of poverty in most countries. But there are some bright lights that I'll try to get to do where things are improving. One of the things that I find really interesting is that the countries that define homelessness in a most encompassing way, right? They're going to include everything you could think of. Those are the countries that are doing best in reducing poverty. It's sort of counterintuitive, right? You wouldn't think that that's the case. But the Nordic countries, for example, they do that. So if somebody's living in a women's shelter or in a hospital or a psychiatric institution, or even if you're in the army and you're not going to have a place to go to when you get out, they count you as homeless. And now, from our perspective in North America, we might think that doesn't make sense, right? But from their perspective, they're doing long-term thinking 3 years from now or 5 years from now, we're going to have to be dealing with all of these people. So they try to address that ahead of time. So that's, and they've been really super successful. That's very much a success story. I think Finland has reduced its homelessness rate by something like 74% from 1988 until today. So that's what the book is about.
Okay. Some of Gregg's students are here tonight, and they would be able to tell you that Gregg is very big on a comparative approach, right? I can see heads nodding, right? So you're examining in this book, using a comparative approach, you're examining poverty from both a cross-national and a cross-temporal perspective. Big question, though, is how does taking a comparative approach help us to understand what's happening here in Canada?
Okay, thanks. So I think there's a lot of really good reasons to do comparative research. One of the things that it does is it provides a backdrop for us, right? So if you hear the rate of poverty is 6%, right? Most of us who don't study this wonder, is that good or is that bad, right? We don't really know how to interpret what that means because we don't know what's possible, right? So those of you, if I asked you to raise your hand, you said it was bad, it's probably because you're comparing it against 0, which is a good thing to compare it against. But we don't know if that's possible, right? And if some of you think that it's really good, might think, well, we know that it's so much worse in the United States. So that's what you're thinking of, right? So having that kind of cross-national and cross-temporal, across time, right, perspective allows us to understand poverty much more deeply, I think, in a much better way. The other thing that allows us to do is to evaluate theories, right? Because there are all kinds of theories, popular accounts of theories, and academic ones, which say, this is why poverty occurs. This is the reason for poverty, right? And so we can test whether those things are true, right? We can evaluate how strong they are with comparative research. So I go through this kind of methodically through different stages of thinking about this. One of the things I mentioned earlier, the 4 Ds, right? The 4 Ds of poverty, the degree, depth, duration, and distribution. That kind of data isn't available for cross-national countries, right? It's not there, unfortunately. So I start off by looking at that data for 3 countries just to kind of see what the trends are in different countries. So here I'm comparing Canada to the UK and the US, right? You might think, well, why those countries, right? They're on almost every kind of study, every kind of typology, they're seen as the countries that are most like us, right? So what can we learn by looking at the UK and looking at the US? So if you think about the varieties of capitalism literature, if you think about the welfare regimes literature, that's what they do, right? They put Canada in the same group as the United States and the UK. So I begin by doing that again, like I said, trying to look at trends, right? And very quickly, just to tell you what I see, if you look at the United States, it's always the worst case. So the United States, the poverty rate, since this, I'm looking at it over almost 5 decades, between 4 and 5 decades. The poverty rate in the United States way back in the 70s was 12%. It goes up a bit, to 13, 15, comes down to 13, 12. It never gets below 12%. So it's just kind of this steady level of poverty, right? But remember, I talked about how important the depth is, the severity of poverty. That gets much worse in the United States. So poverty gets much deeper. In the United States, they use a poverty line that is an absolute measure, which really greatly underestimates the amount of poverty there. And then the depth of poverty, the severity of poverty measure they use is asking how many people have less than half of what the government says you need to survive, right? So think about it. The government sets this poverty line, which is not very good, based on what you need to survive, the amount, what it costs to survive. And today, 45% of the people in poverty have less than half of that. So that's an incredible depth. And that's gotten much worse over the decades. So it used to be 30%, and now we're at 45%. Distribution of poverty, it's the same groups, right? They've gotten a little bit better, but as you can imagine, right, the Black population, Hispanic population, poverty is worse among those groups. It used to be over 3.5 times worse than among the white population. It's still over 2.5 times worse. So it's still very, very bad. Now, if we jump to Canada, again, now remember, this is different data, right? We're just trying to look at the trends to see what's happening in these different countries. In Canada, we do better. The poverty rate goes down, but it's still very high. It went from 13 to 7 or 8%. So that's a notable decline, but it's still very high. And don't forget, the population is so much bigger now after 5 decades, right? As in the United States, the depth of poverty got much worse here. And then, as in the United States, the distribution is pretty much the same, right? So the groups that were much worse off way back decades ago are still the ones that are worse off today. Now, if we could just quickly go to the UK, you see the same pattern, right? There, you don't really see much of a decline in poverty. Again, totally different measures, just to remind you. Steady poverty, depth of poverty going up, same groups that were had high rates of poverty then, still have high rates of poverty now. Right, so that's the first thing that I do, because it's the only way to do that is to use the national data to be able to get at all 4 of those dimensions. Then I switch to the international data sets, right? So that's data sets that's kind of standardized or harmonized. So we're looking at the same, we talk about the poverty rates, it's the same measure across those countries. If we talk about the depth of poverty, it's the same measure for the depth of poverty. Okay, so here's where you see some really interesting things. So the degree or rate of poverty using this standardized measure in Canada and the US is about 12%. And in the United States, it's notably worse, it's 18%. right? So that's a good example where, and this is where many researchers stop, right? They compare Canada to the United States and then think, we can pat ourselves on the back, we're doing really good, right? Because 12% maybe isn't that great, it's a lot better than 18%, right? But we look at other countries, all other countries do better than we do, than Canada, the US, the UK. So that's an important thing to know, and some of them do quite well. So Denmark and Finland, for example, the poverty rate there is 6%. So again, using that standardized measure, the rate in Canada and the UK is twice as high as it is in Finland and Denmark. And in the United States, it's 3 times as high as it is in those countries. Now, if you look at particular groups, you see the same pattern, and it's typically even worse. So think about something like child poverty. So in Finland and Denmark and Sweden too, but especially Finland and Denmark, they tend to do the best now. The child poverty rate is about 4%. So it's lower than the total population poverty rate, which is good to see, right? Few people think that children are responsible for poverty. If you look at the child poverty rate in Canada and the United States, it's 12% again, right? The same as it was for the total population. But if you look at the child poverty rate for the United States now, it's way up to over 22%, I think 22.5%. So that's very, very high, right? So it means that the rates in Canada and the United States, Canada and the UK are 3 times higher than we see in the lowest countries in Europe. And in the United States, their child poverty rate is over 5 times higher than you see in those other countries. Okay, so an interesting thing then, and everybody's probably thinking about how does that happen? How do you explain that? So I have a chapter where I look at the welfare state. I go back to this thing that I had looked at a few books ago and see what's happening today. So there are really dramatic differences in the character and impact of the welfare states in different countries. So I start off by looking at expenditure, right? How much do countries spend? So the Anglo countries, right, Canada, UK, and the US, tend to spend under 20% of their GDP on social programs. And the countries that do best in Europe tend to spend over 30% of their GDP. So that's a huge difference, right? So they're spending a lot more and they're doing a lot more with it. So now if you just look at some programs, I can't go into all the detail of the programs that I talk about, but the income programs that they have, they're much more effective in these European countries, again, especially the Nordic countries, than we see in the Anglo countries. So if we just focus on taxes and transfers, right, just that kind of what I call the first pillar of the welfare state. In the United States, they reduce poverty with taxes and transfers by 30%. So that's, that sounds it's not bad, right? I mean, we know the poverty is still really high. But if you look at Canada, we do much better. So ours is somewhere around 45 or 49%. So that's notably better than in the United States. Now, if you look at Finland and the Nordic countries, they reduce it by over 80%, right? So we're at 80 or 82%. So that's a huge difference, right? So now, all we've talked about so far here is the poverty rates, right? And how they're reduced and how expenditure and so on. We're not even thinking about all the other things that exist. So if you live in any Nordic countries, as we've done for a while, you can see like having access to healthcare and a much more developed kind of healthcare system that we have, childcare for university, all of those kinds of things, right? Those make a huge difference, right? And so people who are living in poverty, it's not fun to be poor anywhere, but they have access to all of those kinds of social services because they're universal. So everybody gets those kinds of things. Again, if you contrast that to the United States where there's no universal healthcare system, right? That's a really very rapidly growing cause of poverty in the United States, right? Because if you have to pay for these kinds of healthcare treatments, then you're losing income while you're sick. Many families go bankrupt, right? So we see that for decades now, where people, parents go in to live with their children because they got sick and they can't afford to stay there. So does that explain why comparison's good? Or should I go on?
That'll do for now. I have one last question for you before we open it up to the audience. Now, one of the questions that a lot of us struggle with, especially when we're investigating issues of social justice and social inequality, is, so what can be done? What do we do about it? Once we investigate these issues and we see the depth of poverty, we understand the struggles and the hardships that people are encountering, what can we do about it? So here's my question. What have you learned from your work that addresses what can be done? Specifically, what should we be doing here in Canada? What would make a difference?
Okay, thanks. So I have a couple of chapters now towards the end of the book as we progress along, because we've set up all this data to try to think now, how do we explain what's going on there, right? And I'll get to some of the kind of practical things that can be done. But before I get to that, I address some of the dominant theoretical traditions, right? The theoretical explanations that we hear most often for poverty. And I sort of categorize them into two broad traditions or schools. So the first one I call the individual-centered one. So it's the one that says that people are responsible, people are responsible themselves, right? And there are different versions of that. One of them is a kind of biogenetic one, right? Everybody's familiar with this. It says it has to do with IQs and those kinds of things, right? The other one is one that's more a cultural one. It says poor people are lazy, they have low aspirations, they have poor work habits, all those kinds of things, right? So I want to address those things. They're actually pretty easy to dismantle. And that's, again, another, as I said earlier on, that's a nice thing you can do with comparative research, right? You can sort of really upend and dismantle or dismiss those kinds of arguments. But I hasten to remind everybody that sometimes an academic will say to me, well, those are really old hat, right? And they're really not. I mean, they've been around forever, so they're old hat in that way. But those are the dominant explanations. Those are the ones that most people believe at some level. You can see it in a whole bunch of places, right? You can see the conservative think tanks that make these kind of arguments all the time. So in the United States, the American Enterprise Institute and the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. In Canada, the Fraser Institute. In the United States, UK, the Center for Social Justice, the Adam Smith Institute. They routinely put out documents making those kinds of arguments, right? You also see it in the things that politicians say, right? Probably the best example I can think of is Clinton, right? The Democrat president of the United States, right? He made the point about we want to give people a hand up, not a handout, right? But what he really meant and what he followed through with immediately was slashing all kinds of programs for poor people. And so, I mean, we see that here too, right? The austerity in the title of the book, that's what we see going on there, right? But we should keep in mind that it's not just austerity now. That's the way our programs have always been designed. Right? We've always had very meager programs for people. We've always had a very long waiting period before you get benefits. We've always had a very short benefit recipiency period. There's always been, checking up on people to make sure they're not abusing the system. And there's always been a high level of stigma. So all of those things really are signs that we think it's the poor people are responsible, right? That's what those designs say. That's what you have to do to stop poor people from abusing the system, right? Again, I go into this in a lot more detail in the book, but you can see that this is not the case, right? It's completely the opposite. If you look at the countries that provide the most benefits, provide the most social services, the most support, they're the ones that have the lowest poverty. They're the ones that have the lowest homelessness. They're the ones that have the declining rates. And it makes perfect sense, right? If you provide childcare for people, if you provide education, all of these kinds of things, it's going to help people, right? So after having dismissed those, then I think, well, then what kind of theoretical approaches are useful? And so I have another chapter where I look at what I call society-centered ones. And again, here there are two kind of sub-variants, and I think they're both really important. So the first one I call socio-political. And very, very quickly to kind of simplify it and summarize it, if you look at all of the countries, if you look at all the rich capitalist countries, right, you see this tremendous variation in poverty levels and depth of poverty, but also in inequality and all those kinds of things. And what does that relate to? Well, if somebody said to me, as people often do in one sentence, tell me what matters the most. Though if I had to do it in one sentence, I wouldn't be happy, but in that one sentence, I'd say unionization rates, right? So countries with really high unionization rates have the lowest poverty rates. So when I started going to Sweden way back in the 1980s, the unionization rate was 87%, which is unbelievably high, right? It was true that when Joan and I would go on a Labor Day parade, there were more people in the parade than there were in the audience, spectators, right? It's a very, very powerful labor movement. The blue collar workers, the white collar workers, the professional unions all worked together and they bargained together. So when they did that, they didn't bargain for, this is what we want for our workers, right? For the auto workers or steel workers or whatever. This is what everybody gets. We're bargaining for childcare for the country. That's the kind of power that they had, right? So that unionization rate, which tends to be linked to there being a left party that exists, a viable left party, and that's typically been in power and for some time. Those two factors are very, very strongly correlated, inversely correlated with very low levels of poverty, more shallow poverty and inequality, right? So that's one thing. What I'm struck by, even though I think that's very, very important, is that no country has eliminated poverty, right? No country has ever eliminated poverty. So even the countries that do very, very well still don't eliminate poverty, right? So why is that the case? And there's a lot of research that's come out recently, even from people who are kind of more mainstream, liberals like Stieglitz and Robert Reich, and of course, people on the left who are looking at what they call structural factors. So they're saying high levels of unemployment, right? Declining unionization levels, austerity, cutbacks to social programs, all of those kinds of things. So the gig economy, the labor-saving technology, right? And they're right on, those things really matter. And it's so nice to see that that's gaining momentum. Those kind of arguments being made instead of, the individual blaming poor people. But I argue that they don't go far enough upstream, right? Because what they miss is that all of those things they mentioned, which are very important, are part of capitalism, right? They're what capitalism, that's what capitalism generates. It's not a fluke, right? That you have poverty in rich countries. That's part and parcel of capitalism. And we need to be able to look at that. We need to be able to talk about that, right? I make a kind of the joke at the beginning of the book that it's like Lord Voldemort in the Harry Potter words, right? Movies and novels, the thing that you can't say. But we need to say it, right? If we can look at schools and everything else and evaluate that, we need to be able to evaluate capitalism and say, where is it going wrong? It's not just that we've stopped regulating. That's a factor. But it's also that markets and corporations are, what I say is they're legally constituted and empowered and enforced through dense networks of laws and property rights and contract rights and tax laws and labor laws and all those kinds of things, right? That's what makes the market. The market isn't this kind of neutral thing. It's this thing that was constructed. And we need to know that and keep that in mind, because then we can think about what can we change, right? How can we change things? So some good analogies that have been used, I think, by different people. One of them is a game of musical chairs, right? Everybody here has probably played that at some point, right? So inequality is built into that game, right? If there's 10 chairs, there's 11 people. The game is structured for people to lose. There has to be less chairs than there are people. And then when one person's eliminated, you take another chair out, right? And that's the way it works. So we have to kind of think of capitalism that way. The other analogy that I really like is the one that Eric Olsen, right, uses. He talks about a chess. He talks about capitalism and the market system as being like a chessboard, right? So that chessboard, we usually focus on the pieces, right? And that's important. That's that socio-political side that I talked about, right? There are different pieces, and some of them are much more powerful than other ones, right? The queen and so on. But they're all limited by the size of the board. They're all limited by the number of squares on the board. They're all limited by the sizes of squares, even the most powerful pieces, right? So we need to think about that and how we can make changes to the board itself. And there are lots of examples about that begin to do that I'll get to in a minute. So really what I think you see, like, from my perspective, explaining poverty, what we see in the world today, the socio-political one does a really good job of telling us why there's so much variation. But the systemic one, the focus on capitalism, tells us why we'll never get lower than a certain amount, right? But there's lots of things that we can learn about it. Now, so now kind of more concrete answers about what's been done. And I talk about this in the very last chapter. So there are all kinds of places, there are all kinds of proposals for really great ideas, and there are all kinds of things that are actually being done now in different places that we need to think about again. Some of them we thought about it, I think too readily dismissed, and we should think about what they can do, right? So Andrew Gortz, a philosopher, makes this distinction between reformist reforms, right? Things like welfare states and so on, which are really great and really helpful, and transformative ones which can at least begin to create something different, like some kind of economic democracy. So what kinds of things are out there? I think basic income is an idea that's dismissed too readily. More developed welfare states, unions, all of these things are going to still be very important in the future. But I think we need to revisit again things like Mondragon, right? Is everybody familiar with the system of co-ops in the Basque region of Spain, right? Where everybody owns all of the co-ops, all the social welfare co-ops, the industrial co-ops, and so on. And they have a thing in place that nobody can make 7 times. The highest paid person can't make more than 7 times what the lowest person makes, right? There are things like the Meidner Plan, which I studied a long time ago when I was first living in Sweden, which is a kind of a way to create economic democracy in the country. So there are all these kinds of things I think we need to bring back and then kind of think about how they might work together. Right. So of course, none of these things are easy, right? People often say, well, do you think that's very likely? And I always think of when somebody says that, especially if they say it kind of, well, that's not likely going to happen. It kind of makes me think of when grade school teachers used to say to me, well, young man, it's not going to happen with that attitude. Right? That's the thing, right? If we just dismiss it, then it's never going to happen, right? So we have to think seriously about those kinds of things. And also we need a little inspiration. So I have a few quotes. I started with one of my favorite quotes. I start the book and I end the book with another one of my favorite quotes. So I'll read those to you and end on that. The first one is from Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was one of the Romantic era poets, English poets, who is Eleanor Marx always says he was a favorite of her father's, and he made them commit some of these things to memory. So here it is. It's from The Mask of Anarchy. Rise like lions after slumber, an unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to the earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. The second one comes from another Irish socialist poet, Oscar Wilde, and he simply says, we're all in the gutter. We need to look at the stars. Thank you.
So does anyone have any questions that they want to pose to Gregg?
Could you speak a little bit about how the Nordic countries define the line by which you define poverty?
How they define it? Yeah, so the European countries tend to use that standardized one, which then I bring the Anglo countries in. So it's a relative measure of poverty if you have 50% or less than what the average individual or family, depending on what you're looking at, has. Right. So they don't have the United States uses this kind of absolute measure. How much does it cost for the most basic food, clothing, and shelter? Right. And then that's where they draw their poverty line. So it's drawn very low. But most European countries, including the UK, use a relative measure. The UK's one isn't quite as good as the other ones because they use a different percentage. But yeah, so I think it's more helpful, right? Because it gets at, it's not simply survival. The United States is this thing of survival, and the fact that you're stayed alive doesn't mean that you have a good life, right? It doesn't mean you have a healthy life. So the life expectancy is much lower, right, in the United States. people are unhealthy because you have the basics needed to serve, to literally survive, doesn't mean that you're living a good life.
We have a question from YouTube as well. Is there any way that we can use the teleological and deontological perspectives to see poverty the way we assess the consequences of social inequality?
I probably would need a translation of that to know exactly what they're after.
That is perfectly fair. So we can put that off to you if you, the person viewing, if you would like to clarify that just a touch for Gregg, we can move along. We do have a follow-up question from another viewer. Palm toward the US South, institutionalized landscape of slavery, and came away convinced of the importance of egalitarian development. Is poverty here an effect of inegalitarian colonial development?
It's certainly a huge part of, I mean, if you look at the groups where poverty is the highest, by far the deepest, it relates to that in all of the countries, all the Anglo countries especially.
What do you think of the effect of the Child Poverty Alliance as a way of fighting poverty in Canada as one of the most recent examples of such?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some groups and some policies in place that have been effective, right? And I don't want to dismiss, that's why we do better than the United States, because we do more of those things. We provide better benefits, more generous ones, but it's also very, very useful for us to remember that the United States is almost the only country we ever do better than, right? So if we want to learn things, right? If we want to feel good about ourselves, then we look at the United States. If we want to think, there's some value in that, I guess, right? But if we want to think about what we can do, then we can look at countries that do a better job than we do.
Perfect. We have another question as well. Did you find any correlation between level individualist ideology in a given country and poverty rate? And do you think changing the narrative to more communitarian value system would make any difference?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's a really important one. So I mentioned that we can kind of dismiss that we can certainly dismiss the culture of poverty idea, but if you're looking at culture the way that this person is implying, then it's really, really important, right? So the Nordic countries in particular have a notion of they're much more collectivist. I mean, it's still a capitalist market economy, but there's a much more bigger notion of being in this together, much less antagonism towards taxation, and they pay way higher taxes than we do, right? But it's not something that's looked at negatively, right? I don't know if people saw, there was a movie that came out a while ago. They're actually interviewing people in downtown Stockholm and ask them if they like taxes. And the response that stuck in my head the most were people were saying, "I love taxes," right? Which sounds so strange to us. But what they really mean when they say they love taxes is they love all of the things that they get from those taxes, right? And they understand that if somebody, a politician says we're going to cut your taxes, what they really mean is we're going to cut the social programs, right? So yeah, it's very, very important to work on that. It's kind of part of the unionization rate and all of those things to think about the culture. There's a very different notion of freedom too, right? So here in the Anglo countries, again, a little bit less in Canada and the UK than the US, but freedom is really freedom from the state, right? I can only be free if the state isn't anywhere near me. The farther the state moves away, the freer I am. And that makes no sense at all to Swedes and Norwegians and Danes and so on, Finns, right? Because they know that their freedom is dependent upon having all of these kinds of social programs. When you have childcare, that frees you. When you don't have to pay to go to university, right? Ask any students here, that frees you. That frees all those kinds of things. So it's just a different way of thinking about what freedom is and how you can become free.
Thank you.
Oh dear. Thanks, Greg. That was fantastic. If you ever get tired of sociology, there's a lot of economics departments that could really use you. I think the numbers you were providing are after tax and transfers for poverty. So is the same level of difference between countries present in market-based measures of poverty? And if it's not, if the market-based the market measure of poverty closer between nations, does that mean that the tax and transfer system is the big measure to reduce poverty here, or whether or not there's some other elements of social and economic structure that creates more or less poverty on a market-based measure as opposed to after tax and transfer?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. I was actually shocked when I saw how high the rates were before the taxes and transfers kick in, right? But you know, you have to remind yourself that people never experience that because the programs are already there. But if you factored in if they weren't there, then the numbers would be higher than you'd think, given the high level of unionization, for example, right?
In Sweden, public ads, billboards, remind people of collective values. What would you change about public messaging in Canada? Yeah,
that's a really good question too. So it's one of those things that you have to work on slowly. But I guess we have one of the world experts in corporal punishment here with us. And so for people who don't know, in 1979, Sweden was the first country in the world to introduce a corporal punishment ban, right? And what's so interesting about that is the way they changed people's minds. So in the early 1970s, Swedes weren't that different from us, right? There was a notion that, you know, parents have a right to hit their children, and that's the way it should be, right? But there was other groups of people didn't think that was right, that it was morally wrong and that it shouldn't happen, right? And so what did they do? This gets at the question more directly. They bought out spaces on cereal boxes and milk cartons that raised the question, should we be hitting our children? And a picture of a children, don't I have the right not to be hit too, like all of you? And it generated discussion, right, among families. And so in a very short time period, surprising progress was made and people changed their attitudes. And now it's very, very difficult to find anybody in Sweden who think that would be okay. And the other really thing that great idea of that as a success story is how many countries followed suit. So pretty quickly after, as you'd expect, the other Nordic countries did, and some other European countries, but a lot of other developing countries did too. And what's the number at now? 63 countries, right? So think about that now. So as a result of what happened to this one country and making these kind of change, we're doing this kind of, promoting in this kind of way, had such a tremendous impact that we see this around the world.
We do have time for one final question.
Absolutely. Thanks for the excellent presentation. Greg, do you have an example of a country that could serve as a model for moving from a very inequitable, high inequality country to one that is more equal? If you look at Piketty's argument, for example, he seems to explain everything away with these crises, right? You have World War II, and then suddenly everybody's equal, and then he starts to explain why you become more unequal. But can you explain the reverse? Do we have a path? Is there a blueprint out there?
Yeah, maybe I can give you examples of both directions. As people may not be aware, the Nordic countries, the early 1900s, late 1800s were very, very poor, right? So, I mean, I'm reminded of this sometimes when I go to Minneapolis. One time we were driving back to Windsor, our hometown, and I had ordered a book, in Minneapolis at a bookstore. And when I came to pick it up, I said, here, pick up the book for Olsen, and the person behind the counter just kind of went, what's your first name? Because in Minneapolis and Minnesota, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of Olsens, right? Because all the Scandinavians moved from those poor countries to various places across the United States and Canada way back then. So it's gradually changed, right, with unionization and with the welfare state hope I'm answering your question, over time, right? And it wasn't overnight. It was as these things were built up. What happened in a country in the other direction is when I was in looking at the regional funding, the Meidner plan way back in, I interviewed some of the top people, the top capitalists in Sweden, Stockholm, and you might think, that they're, really, progressive, and they're not, right? They think just like anybody else in that world, right? And so they were telling me, they'd say, the problem with Sweden is it's a socialist country, and we're going to change it. And it's going to take us 30 or 40 or 50 years, but we're going to do it, right? He used the analogy of an ocean liner, right? He said, just do a quick left turn or right turn in this case. It's going to take a very long time. And he said, but when he actually used the phrase, we'll capture the hearts and minds of people and make them more individualistic. And when I was talking to this guy, he had a huge picture all lit up of Reagan behind him, right? And he was saying, the mistake we've made is to look to the United States as the place to go. He said, we shouldn't look to the United States. They've never had good social programs. We want to look at a country like New Zealand that used to be very developed and really cut them back. That's where we can learn, right? So you have these kind of two stories, two directions of things happening.
If you have any closing comments at all, you're more than welcome to offer them.
He's talking to you.
Invisible man.
Greg.
No, I think I'm done. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to say thank you very much, Greg, and thanks everyone.
Yes, thank you all very much. And thank you, Greg and Elizabeth, for such an incredibly stimulating conversation. This is our final in-person event for the year, and I can't think of a better way of winding down our fall event season. So thank you so very much, both of you. We are going to move along to the signing portion of the evening. So in just a moment, we'll be situating Greg behind a table, which is just beyond the cash desk. We'll ask you all to just give us one moment to get him seated, and then please do come out and visit us. If you already have a copy of the book, please feel free to approach the table to get it signed. If you have yet to purchase a copy of the book, please do feel free to just visit our cash desk. We have a pile right behind there, so they're very easily accessible. If you have one and simply haven't paid for it, please just pay for it at some point, and then you're welcome to leave the store. I'd like to close once again by thanking the University of Toronto Press, all of you for joining us here, for braving the cold, and for watching on YouTube from around the world. And I'd like to ask you all to join me one final time in acknowledging Elizabeth Comack and Gregg M. Olsen. Thank you so much.
Thanks for describing why my grandparents got to Canada. Oh, yeah. They were starving to death there.